I've always believed that family should feel like a safe harbor. But that morning in my kitchen, I realized how wrong I was. My daughter-in-law, standing there like she owned the place, made it clear that in her eyes, I was an obstacle, not family. I remember the sting of her words, how they cut sharper than anything I could have imagined, and the panic that rose inside me as I realized she was ready to call the police, claiming I'd lost my mind. For a moment, everything felt surreal, my own home. The space I had filled with memories for over 30 years suddenly felt alien. I had learned early in life to trust my instincts, and something deep inside me told me to stay calm. I had a recording device tucked discreetly in my pocket, something I had set up weeks ago when the tension had first started to feel unbearable. I remember feeling a mix of fear and quiet determination, the kind that comes from knowing you cannot let yourself be pushed out, not quietly, not without standing for what is yours. As I reflect on that moment, I realize it was the point where I had to make a choice retreat and let my house, my life, my dignity slip away, or take action, even if it meant stepping into conflict. And so, I began preparing, quietly gathering evidence and steadying my thoughts, knowing that in the hours to come, everything would change. I couldn't help but wonder, as I took a deep breath and straightened my back, how far people could go when they felt entitled. And in that mix of fear and anticipation, I realized this story was not just about me. It was a test of courage, patience, and resilience. The question I silently asked myself then was simple. Could I outsmart someone who underestimated me completely? Little did I know that within hours, the day that had started with betrayal would lead to revelations I could never have imagined. I never imagined that 8 months ago, when my son Michael lost his job at the accounting firm, letting him and his wife, Jennifer, stay with me would become a decision that changed everything. At first, I believed it was temporary, a brief stop until he got back on his feet. I remember the hope in his eyes when he arrived with 2 small suitcases, reassuring me that he just needed a place to regroup. I wanted to help, because that's what families do. My home in Maplewood, Ohio, had been my sanctuary for over 30 years. My late husband, Robert, had left it to me, along with a comfortable retirement after decades of teaching. I thought the walls of my house would protect me from the world, but soon I realized that the danger wasn't outside. It was right inside my front door. Jennifer, with her carefully curated designer clothes and constant scrolling on her phone, never contributed to the household in a meaningful way. And Michael, distracted and hesitant, seemed unwilling to confront his wife's growing entitlement. I remember feeling that quiet, simmering frustration, the kind that creeps in when small irritations accumulate over months. They claimed to help around the house, but the reality was far different. Groceries went uneaten or were eaten without gratitude. Dishes remained in the sink for days. And yet, when I gently suggested that perhaps the temporary arrangement had lasted long enough, I was met with a cold, dismissive response that shook me more than I expected. As the weeks passed, I started noticing the little signs: expensive vacations booked without a word, a lavish coffee habit, casual remarks about my pension. I felt a mix of disbelief and anger. I kept asking myself how I had allowed this to happen, how I had let someone make me feel small in the space that was always mine. But at the same time, I had to admit, a part of me had clung to the hope that family bonds would override selfishness, that love and shared history would keep them accountable. Looking back, it was the small betrayals that cut the deepest. The way Jennifer would casually dismiss my contributions, the subtle undermining of my authority in my own home, and the way Michael would glance at me guiltily but remain silent. Those months built a tension that was almost unbearable, like a storm gathering strength behind a calm sky. And yet, in the quiet moments, I reminded myself that I was capable of more than just enduring. I started to prepare, to pay attention, to quietly take note of patterns and behaviors that might protect me later. Little did I know that the choices I made in those quiet months setting up a recording device, keeping a careful record, would become my lifeline in the days to come. As I paused, reflecting on how trust had been stretched thin and loyalty had been exploited, I realized the story was no longer just about patience or kindness. It was about survival, about standing for myself in ways I had never thought I would need to, and I knew that soon. The fragile balance in my home would shatter, and everything I had held on to would be tested in ways I could not yet imagine. The next morning, when Jennifer crossed the line in a way I could no longer ignore, I was ready to respond, but not with anger, not impulsively. I had prepared myself for the moment when patience ran out, and it was coming faster than I expected. The day Jennifer told me I was free to leave if I didn't like living with them felt like a punch to the chest. Standing in my own kitchen, seeing the audacity in her eyes, I realized that her sense of entitlement had crossed every line I had ever imagined. For a moment, I felt frozen, caught between disbelief and rising anger. How could someone behave this way in a home that had always been filled with love, memories, and my husband's presence? I remember looking at Michael, hoping he would speak up, hoping he would see what I had been feeling all these months. But he didn't. He looked uncomfortable, unsure, perhaps unwilling to confront his wife's boldness. That silence hit harder than any words Jennifer could have thrown at me. And at that moment, something shifted inside me. I understood that the old me, polite, accommodating, forgiving, was no longer enough. I went upstairs, my heart steady despite the rush of adrenaline. I began packing Jennifer's belongings, not as an act of cruelty, but as a statement of ownership and boundaries. Her designer clothes, her expensive handbags, the items she treated as trophies of entitlement, they went into the suitcase as I reflected on the months of silent endurance. I felt calm, almost serene, realizing that taking action didn't have to mean losing grace or composure. When Jennifer saw what I was doing, the panic and shock on her face only reinforced what I had always sensed, that she had counted on my compliance, on my reluctance to confront her. I stayed composed, quietly thinking about the recording device I had tucked in my pocket, the weeks of careful preparation that had seemed tedious at the time, but now felt like a lifeline. Then came the real betrayal, the call she had planned to law enforcement. The moment she tried to turn the tables and make me appear irrational. My mind raced, weighing fear against clarity. I realized that she had not acted impulsively. This had been deliberate, orchestrated. She thought she could manipulate the system, the police, even her own husband, to make me disappear quietly. And yet, in the midst of the tension, I found an unexpected steadiness. I reminded myself that I was not powerless. Every detail I had observed, every note, every recording could protect me. I knew I had to remain calm, to think ahead, to let her actions reveal her intentions without panicking. As the doorbell rang and I saw the flashing lights of authority on the porch, I felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. This was the turning point. The storm I had been preparing for months was finally breaking. And I understood that how I responded now would determine everything. I took a deep breath and reminded myself courage does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and the quiet, deliberate steps can be the most powerful. With that thought, I moved toward the unfolding chaos, ready to face the consequences, but determined that I would not be the victim she expected me to be. The moment the man introduced himself as Jennifer's doctor, I felt a chill run through me. Something about his presence, the polished suit, the confident tone, immediately set off alarms in my mind. I realized quickly that I had never met him before, that this entire setup had been planned down to the last detail. The idea that someone could step into my home and present themselves as a professional to manipulate law enforcement was shocking, but I reminded myself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help me now. I reflected on the months leading up to this, Jennifer's subtle manipulations, the tiny comments about my memory, her insistence that I had become forgetful. None of it had been accidental. Each remark, each suggestion had been carefully placed to erode my confidence, to set the stage for this very moment. And yet, even as the officers and the paramedic questioned me, I felt an unexpected clarity. I was aware, and that awareness was my power. I thought about how easy it would have been to doubt myself, to wonder if perhaps I had become confused or forgetful. But the truth was undeniable. I remembered every conversation, every detail, and most importantly, I had the recording in my pocket. That small device, which I had set up weeks ago, suddenly felt like a lifeline. It wasn't just evidence, it was proof of my reality, of my presence, of my right to stand firm in my own home. As the so-called doctor spoke, I began to piece together the larger pattern. Jennifer wasn't acting alone. Her careful preparation, the timing, the audacity, it all pointed to a deliberate, orchestrated plan. My mind traced the steps backward, realizing that her previous marriages to older men, each with untimely deaths and conveniently transferred assets, fit a chilling pattern. And it hit me, this was not merely a personal betrayal. It was a professional scheme, one that had likely victimized others in the same quiet, calculated way. I felt a surge of determination. The fear I had felt just moments before transformed into a kind of fierce focus. I knew that by remaining composed and collecting evidence, I could not only protect myself, but potentially expose the broader network. I reminded myself of everything I had done, the recordings, the careful observation of Jennifer's behaviors, the documentation of every irregularity. Each step I had taken quietly over the past months now coalesced into a strategy for survival and justice. When my lawyer arrived, it was as if the final pieces clicked into place. Her calm authority reassured me, and together, we began to unravel the carefully constructed lies. The man posing as a doctor faltered under scrutiny, revealing cracks in his story. I felt a mix of shock and vindication as I realized that all the months of manipulation, of doubt cast over me, were about to be overturned. As Jennifer's composure began to crumble, I reflected on the irony of it all. Here I was, the woman she had thought weak and easily manipulated, calmly exposing the truth and taking control of the situation. And it wasn't just about me anymore. This revelation meant the possibility of helping others, of stopping her from harming more families, of turning my pain and frustration into meaningful action. Even as the authorities began to act, I stayed mindful, steadying myself with each breath. I thought about how carefully she had chosen her timing, the assumptions she had made about my compliance, and the confidence she had displayed. And yet, here I was, prepared, clear-headed, and unwavering. The lessons of patience, observation, and quiet planning had equipped me to meet this moment head-on. In the midst of chaos, a strange calm enveloped me. I understood that fear could have frozen me, but awareness, preparation, and the choice to act with integrity had turned a moment of potential victimization into a turning point of empowerment. I allowed myself a brief, private acknowledgement of pride, not arrogance, but the quiet satisfaction of standing firmly in my own truth. As the authorities began to secure the evidence and detain those involved, I realized that this was only the beginning of uncovering the full scope of Jennifer's actions. There was a larger network, a broader system, and I would be ready. But for the first time in months, I felt a sense of control, of agency, and of resilience that I hadn't known I still possessed. And in that calm clarity, I made a quiet promise to myself I would see this through, not only for my own protection, but for the protection of others. And I would never again allow anyone to make me feel powerless in the place I had called home for decades. After the initial shock of exposing Jennifer and the fake doctor, I felt a deep sense of responsibility. I realized that my fight wasn't just about reclaiming my home or protecting my savings, it was about stopping her from harming anyone else. I thought about the other families, the elderly people who might have been quietly victimized by the same patterns I had noticed. That thought ignited a determination in me I hadn't known I still possessed. I began to coordinate carefully with the authorities, providing every recording, every note, and every observation I had collected over the past months. Each piece of evidence was a brick in building a case strong enough to not only protect me, but to dismantle the network Jennifer had relied on. I felt a strange calm as I realized that my patience and preparation had been worth it. Michael, my son, was still processing everything. I watched him grapple with disbelief, confusion, and guilt. I reflected quietly on the fact that he hadn't intentionally enabled Jennifer's schemes, but his inaction had made him a silent witness. I needed to guide him gently, helping him understand the importance of respect, accountability, and vigilance within our family. In that moment, I realized that empowerment was not just personal, it was about lifting others, even when it's difficult. As the investigations unfolded, I felt a wave of relief and pride when Jennifer's actions were confirmed, and authorities began recovering the stolen funds. The thought that I had helped prevent her from exploiting more families filled me with a quiet, steady joy. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about justice, and the balance that comes from standing firm in truth. I reflected on how months of subtle observation, careful recording, and quiet resolve had prepared me for this moment. I realized that empowerment often comes not from force or confrontation, but from understanding, patience, and knowing when to act decisively. Each choice I had made, from documenting behaviors to remaining calm under provocation, had built toward this outcome. In my home, restored to its rightful order, I felt the weight of months of stress lift slightly. The air seemed lighter, the walls familiar and safe again. And yet, I also knew that vigilance would remain a part of my life. Knowing that people like Jennifer exist doesn't make me fearful, it makes me aware. It teaches me to trust my instincts, to protect myself, and to never underestimate the power of preparation. As I watched Michael begin to comprehend the reality of the situation, I felt a quiet sense of teaching and guidance. He began to see the importance of integrity, of standing up when needed, and of understanding the difference between love and enabling destructive behavior. I understood then that empowerment in family drama isn't just about action, it's about clarity, communication, and leading by example. And as the authorities took the necessary steps to secure justice, I realized that my life had changed in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was no longer just a passive observer in my own home. I was active, aware, and capable. The fear that had once shadowed me was replaced by determination, and I felt a renewed sense of confidence and control. Even as I sat quietly in my kitchen, thinking about all that had happened, I understood one fundamental truth. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, steady and deliberate, growing stronger with each small, careful choice we make. And in choosing to stand firm, I had not only protected myself, but had contributed to a larger good, ensuring that others would not suffer in silence as I almost had. The path to justice was not easy, but it was deeply rewarding. I felt proud, not just of what had been achieved legally, but of the growth it had inspired within me. The lessons of patience, vigilance, and moral clarity had solidified into something I could carry forward, guiding both myself and my family into a future that felt safer, brighter, and more aligned with the values we truly believed in. Sitting in my garden with a cup of tea, I felt the weight of the past months finally begin to lift. The house that had been my sanctuary, tested by betrayal and manipulation, now felt whole again. I thought about the journey from the initial shock of Jennifer's audacity, through the careful preparation and quiet resilience, to the eventual exposure of the fraud that had threatened not only me, but countless others. I reflected on the lessons I had learned, the importance of trusting my instincts, the strength that comes from patience, and the power of standing firm even when those around me hesitate. I realized that courage is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is measured, deliberate, and grounded in clarity. I had discovered a depth of resilience within myself that I hadn't known existed. Watching Michael, my son, begin to understand the gravity of the situation, I felt a quiet pride. He was learning that respect, vigilance, and integrity are essential in protecting both oneself and loved ones. And as the news came that the network had been dismantled and victims were beginning to be restored to safety, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The experience had been harrowing, but it also revealed that refusing to be a victim is in itself a profound act of courage. If this story resonates with you, I hope it inspires you to trust your instincts, protect your boundaries, and never underestimate the quiet power of persistence. Share your thoughts, comment your experiences, and remember, you are never powerless when you stand for your truth.